on Windows Weekly. Mary Jo and Paul are here to talk about all the ways Windows is fighting back against the vicious Chromebook. Plus, we'll talk about everything that happened at the Microsoft Connect conference. And we've got lots of picks, app picks, enterprise picks, even beer picks coming up on Windows Weekly.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
This is Windows Weekly, episode 598, recorded Wednesday, December 5th, 2018. Giant hairball of code. This episode of Windows Weekly is brought to you by PRILOCK Security. Teach your employees how to keep your company secure by avoiding phishing emails, candy drops, and social engineering. Show them how and why hackers attack with training. Go to prilock.com/twit and use the promo code LEO to save 30%. And by Rocket Mortgage by Quicken Loans, introducing Rate Shield Approval. If you're in the market to buy a home, Rate Shield Approval locks up your rate for up to 90 days while you shop. It's a real game changer. Learn more and get started at rocketmortgage.com/windows. And by WordPress, reach more customers when you build your business website on WordPress.com. Plans start at just $4 a month. Get 15% off any new plan at WordPress.com/windows. Welcome to Windows Weekly. This is the show where we talk about all things Microsoft, Windows, etc. I'm Megan Maroney. Leo Laporte is gone this week. But of course, I'm joined by the show's real stars, Mary Jo Foley and Paul Thurrott. Thanks so much for having me on your show.
It's not like Leo is a real star.
Well, Leo is
of
the
some
real star.
quantity.
Yes, I guess so. I am excited because the last two times I co-hosted, it was sort of the lull in the cycle of Windows news. But now I feel like there's a lot of, at the very least, rumors of interesting things going on.
Yes.
So is Microsoft getting rid of Edge, its 3-year-old browser?
Yes.
No.
Was that a yes?
That was the big rumor. That was the big rumor of the week. So we don't know for sure because it is still a rumor at this point. But Windows Central had a story this week saying Microsoft is building a Chromium-powered web browser that will replace Edge on Windows 10. They say this thing is codenamed Anaheim. And then if you read into the story, it gets a little more iffy because they say they're throwing in the towel with Edge HTML, which is the rendering engine, the fork of Microsoft's Trident, which was MS HTML, that powers Edge. So it's unclear if they, like the way they wrote the story, at first you're like, oh, they're getting rid of Edge. But then you're like, wait, maybe they're getting rid of the rendering engine in Edge and swapping it out.
The problem is that they don't know themselves. And,
right.
But based on logic and common sense, it seems like Microsoft is doing what they should have done all along, which is build a browser application off of a standards-based popular rendering engine, because that's not where the innovation needs to occur. And of course, unfortunately, in the Microsoft world, in the Microsoft kind of fan base world, when you hear something like this, we immediately go into some sort of a suicidal dive because everyone's really tired of Microsoft killing everything we love. But a couple things about Edge is not many people love it. It's barely used. It only registers somewhere in the 3% range usage worldwide. And it doesn't really kind of matter, honestly. I look at this kind of thing like the vestiges of Microsoft past. I think that in Microsoft, I think as fans, there are people who also believe this way that, they've always done this kind of thing. They make their own browser. They make their own operating system. They have to innovate on these platforms. And it's like, this is not really what matters. And this is a direct result, I think, of the whole Satya Nadella change thing, that, partner where it makes sense, be open to everybody, be inclusive to all technologies, and innovate where it makes sense. Yep. And innovating in a browser rendering engine that's only going to impact Windows 10 makes no sense.
I know. So do you remember when they came out with Edge. It was codenamed Spartan. And I remember when they first talked about it, I'm like, so what's the rendering engine? And they're like, it's brand new. Like, it's something totally new. And I'm like, but what is it?
Yep.
Right. And finally, I got them to say it was a fork of MS-HTML. I'm like, oh, so it's Trident. And they're like, no, that's what we don't want people to say. We don't want them to say we're using our rendering engine. But I'm like, but you're not using
E logo.
Right. And you're not using
if you don't
Blink.
want people to associate it with the old thing, don't make it look exactly like the old thing.
No, you know why they did that, right? Like the real reason? Because a lot of people, like my mom, they don't even know what a browser is. She calls it E. She's like, I'll have to say to her, go to the E, which is Internet Explorer, and now Edge. So they kept the E for that. That's why. That's the real reason.
No, I know. That makes sense. It's a muscle memory thing. I get that. But anyway, I view this as just incredibly smart and the right thing to do. Overdue, one would say. If you go back to that time period you were just talking about, when Microsoft was talking about this thing as if it were an all new thing, they were very briefly going to put it, this rendering engine, in the version of IE that shipped with Windows 10, and then later decided not to for whatever reason. I'm sure I should dig this up. I know at the time I said they should not do this. This is stupid. Nobody needs this. Nobody wants this. It's just like some weird platform imperative from a group that can't get beyond the fact that this is not what matters anymore. And I think finally this change we're seeing across Microsoft is starting to hit the Windows group. And I think, was it last week or 2 weeks ago when I, off the cuff, this was not something in the notes or something we planned to talk about, but we were talking about whatever. And I said, Microsoft should just stop worrying about this core OS development stuff, base Windows on Linux, ship the user experience everyone expects on top of that, and let it run Windows apps, and who would care? Like your mother, she would never know. It looked just like Windows. It'd be Windows.
Right.
And, the thing that makes Windows is the ability to run Windows applications, Yeah. And there's no indication of doing that. It's just an idea I had off the. It probably makes no sense. It doesn't really matter. But the point is, this is the same kind of thing applied to the browser. Focusing on what matters, the user experience, right? And not focusing on what doesn't matter. A rendering engine. It's silly.
Right.
This has been solved.
So when this happened, when this rumor came out from Windows Central, like everyone's pinging you and me, and they're like, "Oh my God, you guys are going to like flip out." And I'm like, "No, if this makes Edge work for me, I don't care what they do under the covers, right? Like the reason I can't use Edge is many of the websites I use in my browser don't work with Edge. And I know I've seen all the telemetry from Microsoft that says Edge is the fastest, it's the best, it's the most compatible, it's this, it's that. Try loading Edge. Try loading TweetDeck.com in Edge on a lower powered machine like the Surface Go. It's a no-go. No, not happening.
The other thing is, the other complaint you kind of hear along those lines is that, excuse me, that, Microsoft is kind of giving up something that users want or need or whatever. And the reality is, if they deliver this thing, that it looks like Edge. It could be called Edge. We don't know what it's going to be called, but let's pretend it's just called Edge.
It's got to be called Edge, right?
Well, we know it'll start with an E at the very least.
I would assume.
There's some evidence. Maybe they should walk away from that. But whatever. Honestly, that doesn't matter. I think it would be very interesting. It would be like the Project Mojave thing. You could just hand it to someone. They say, "Yeah, I could use this. This is great." Like, yeah, it's Chrome. Who cares? Who cares what it is? Or the kind of monoculture complaint we hear from people who say,
"Well, the big one.
Great,
right?
Yeah, great." And this is a complete misconception. And I think I had this conversation with you earlier, but Mary Jo. But you can use words to make something sound good or make something sound bad. And so one of the words you might use is monoculture, because that sounds terrible. I would use the word standard. That instead of a bunch of different browsers doing things in slightly different ways, outscoring each other slightly in different standardized, web tests, rendering certain pages differently, poorly or better in some cases, it would be better if that stuff just worked the same way everywhere.
Yeah.
And with Blink and Blink / I call it more like Blink / WebKit as kind of a standard for this kind of thing, Microsoft can do what it should have been doing all along, and innovating with the application itself. Yep. And on the OS side, with OS integration features that make sense, that don't, it shouldn't matter what the rendering engine is.
Right. But this whole monoculture what would you call it? Not diatribe, but like the whole argument around, the reason that Microsoft didn't want to use that same WebKit / blank rendering engine was because you should have multiple implementations of a standard, and that's what keeps a standard a standard. They were the ones who pushed that argument. Microsoft was the one who got that in everybody's head, right?
Right. But
it wasn't like some random people thinking it.
Of course. In the same way that Apple fans will kind of parrot things that Apple says on stage or whatever. Yeah, it makes sense that Microsoft fans would do the same too. This idea got in their head somewhere, Right. A monopoly is terrible when you don't own the monopoly. We need to fight the monopoly, But again, I look, I'm on board with the whole monopoly is a terrible thing, I guess. But that's not what this is about. No one is making money from a rendering engine, right? There's no insidious backroom, machination that's occurring that makes Google make money from Blink.
Right.
It's not, I realize it's not literally an open standard, but it is what I guess I would call a de facto standard. And it's not where innovation needs to occur. It's not.
Right. I agree. The thing I wonder, and again, because this is a rumor and we don't know at this point, where you have to just kind of guess, is so you have to look at who is this bad for, if it's bad for anyone. Like, is it bad for the industry? Is it bad for developers? Is it bad for users? The only group there I'm kind of wondering about is developers. And I don't think there are that many people who built apps or sites
like
optimized
HTML
for
apps
Edge. Right? But
remember, one of the big parts of the store platform now, the store app platform, is what used to be called a different, I forget the previous name for this, but there was a web app type that could be in the store, and now we have progressive web apps, right?
Yeah.
And these things web apps are kind of held up as a way for you to write a thing that runs kind of everywhere, especially if you do it correctly. And honestly, that type of app, I would say in particular, becomes better if there's a standard rendering engine, if we're just using Chrome, right? Because now the thing you're going to put in the store is going to look the same on the web. If someone pins it with Chrome on the Mac or whatever, this web app kind of works the same everywhere. So there might be some short-term pain for developers who have to take existing apps that are based on web technologies in the store,
test them again,
and then redo them, for the Chrome engine. But I said, I don't mean to be a jerk about this. I think that developers win overall by far. I think it's a no-brainer. That said,
well, going forward for sure, right? Because you're writing to one thing.
Yeah, but but if you have to make life painful for one group, right, in the Hill ecosystem, it has to be developers. It has to be. They're the ones that are going to have to do the hard work because they're few in number. They only target a couple of different things, relatively speaking, to the world. You don't make it hard on users. You don't make it hard on businesses. You make it hard on developers. Again, not to be a jerk about it, but I mean, that's the lot in life there. I mean, that's...
Paul? Developers.
No, but again,
just saying.
I think most yes. Thank you, Steve Ballmer. But I think most developers hearing this would agree that this will make their life better in the long run, and that's what makes it worthwhile.
Yeah. Again, if any of this happens, so far this is. I do have a lot
of writing on this actually working.
That was me channeling my inner Steve Ballmer.
A little less sweaty.
A little less sweaty.
But yeah, I mean, again, from user standpoint, this is a win. For Microsoft, it's a win. This is a thing, like Microsoft has been pumping engineering effort and dollars and time into developing something that doesn't matter.
Right.
Literally doesn't matter in the slightest to the success of the platform. Zero. Yep. This is an effort they can just give up. And plus, I think it goes nicely with the whole inclusivity thing that Satya Nadella preaches and Microsoft follows. That it's going to be a good citizen and a partner with whatever partners. With open source, with whatever. And I still in my again, a lot of people think of me as incredibly negative. I have this almost Pollyanna kind of thing going on with a lot of technology. I have a firm belief, despite zero evidence to this effect and plenty of evidence to the contrary, that Google and Microsoft can somehow have a better relationship, and that things like this are how they get there. And
you do have that weird idea that these two are going to be friends one day.
I know. I'm a kind of a sunny sky kind of guy.
Yeah, that's not you, but that's not the Paul Thurrott I know. But I'm more of a skeptic on that than you are. I'm like, nah, I think they're still enemies. I don't think they're friends.
But but a lot of times competition has an interesting way of getting companies to work together. To those other competitors, and you see interesting tie-ups. Microsoft and Amazon tying up over Alexa is what?
Yeah, I
mean,
know.
you kind of have to look at that and say, if that could happen.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Anything's possible.
Yeah.
There's an opportunity, and again, zero evidence for this to happen, but an opportunity for something to happen with Windows that should have happened a long time ago as well, which is to get Android apps running on Windows, And if they base this thing on Chrome OS runs Android. I know, it's crazy. It's crazy. But again, I believe.
But
I want to believe.
Your next story is also kind of against, trying Windows fighting against Google, right? With Windows Lite, like that's also to, stem the tide of Chromebooks, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Not to rain on your parade because it's beautiful.
No,
Paul. It's beautiful when you're optimistic. Don't get me wrong.
But let me shine a little ray of optimism on this one as well, because if you think about Google's platforms, Android and Chrome OS, there's probably never any time in which Chrome OS surpasses Android. Android is humongous. It's billions of users. The size of the market that could be addressed by Chrome OS is much smaller than the size of the market that could be addressed by pure Android. And so for Google, it's a nice thing to do. It's smart. It helps them get in with businesses, especially education, which is super important for future customers. But it's never going to be the volume business that Android is, right? It also provides, I think, some interesting technical know-how for this future fuchsia thing they're working on. But as far as like a present strategy thing, it's kind of a minority deal for them. For Windows, PCs are it, and so there is kind of an imperative that Microsoft needs to get the PC experience right. And a couple 5 years ago, whatever it was, Microsoft was working on Project Astoria, I remember, to help bring Android apps into the store, but they had worked out a way for Android apps to work on Windows 10, and it worked great. In fact, it worked so well, they killed Project Astoria because it would have killed any need by any developer to write a native Windows 10 application like a UWP type app. That's the reason that was killed. So we already know this can work. Now that they've woken up to what matters and what doesn't matter, and by the way, as we'll discuss later, to the fact that actual Windows developers are still targeting what I would call legacy APIs and SDKs and so forth, not the new stuff. Maybe that's something that could happen again. So I get it. There's no Windows Lite is absolutely a Chrome OS competitor wannabe.
Right.
I don't.
So let's back up a second because we didn't really.
What it is.
Yeah, we didn't introduce what this is. So last week on Windows Weekly, my codename pick of the week was Windows Lite, if anybody remembers that. And the way we found out about this was Taro Alhonen, who listens to our show, posted a list of the SKUs that he could see in the Windows 10 SDK for build 18282. There's a whole list. It's like Product Cloud, Product Hub OS, Product Andromeda is there, Product IoT OS, and then at the very bottom, this little thing called Product Lite, Lite. And so, as we said last week on the show, I'm like, I wonder what that is. And then Brad gets some information.
Wasn't there a guy from ZDNet that had written about this like months ago? Windows 10 Lite?
I don't think so.
Liam somebody?
I don't think so. Liam? Liam Tung?
Let me see if I can find it.
Yeah, see if you find it. Anyway, so then Brad got some information where he said, yeah, this is a very stripped down, simplified version of Windows that may ultimately not even be called Windows. And the reason for that is, if you think about what Microsoft did with Windows 10S, as Paul has pointed out many times on this show, people got confused who bought machines running that. There weren't very many machines running it, but there were a few. And people who bought it often didn't realize what that meant. It meant you can only run apps from the store and you can't download things like Chrome because you're stuck with Edge. You're stuck with only apps that are in the Microsoft Store. And so a lot of people are like, wait, what is this? I don't want this. And so if they did decide to take this thing called Windows 10 Lite, a stripped down version, and renamed it, the reason they would rename it is to just totally show people like, this is something different. This is not the Windows that you know, right?
By the way, I'm sorry, I did find the article. It was called Windows 10 Lean.
Oh, Lean. So you know what? Lean is not light, by the way. Those are two different things, which is crazy. I know.
It's Windows Diet.
Yeah, Windows
10 Keto.
Windows Keto. No, it's not. No, Windows 10 Lean. Windows 10 Lean. We never actually found out what that was, but I remember, I think it was Windows Central again that said they thought that, which was codenamed Cloud E, which is one of the things on the SKU list, is a version of Windows meant for machines that are constrained in RAM and maybe CPU. And that it's kind of like, okay, for machines that can't easily upgrade to a new version or switch in and out of S mode easily, there was this thing called Windows 10 Lean. So Lean is not the same thing as Light, just to make it is, in fact, actually
Windows. But Windows 10 Lite, which will almost certainly not be called Windows 10 anything, it's got to be based on the same
It's Windows
core,
still.
Right? Windows has been componentized. Yep. There's some core part of it that is smaller than the thing we get on disk.
Yep.
And then they add some UX on top of it, and it runs store apps.
Correct. So then the question becomes, okay, they've tried this with Windows RT. They've tried this with Windows 10 S, Windows 10 in S mode. Can this thing succeed? Because again, it sounds like it's going to be restricted to store apps. What's going to make it different?
I would say no normally to this, right? You know how I feel about these things. Like something that looks like Windows that doesn't run Windows apps, nonsense. Now there's a possibility, like I think you said, that this won't look like Windows and won't be called Windows. And I think that's maybe the smartest thing they could do. But we still have to kind of come back to what is the impetus for this? Why would they do this, right? I mean, Microsoft coming out with a Chrome OS copy, if you will, years ago might have made some sense. Doing it today, what's the rationale? And the only thing I can think of, and I'm guessing like we have to do so often with these things, is that their biggest customer base is asking for it, businesses. We know that business adoption of Chrome is actually really big from a growth perspective. Big enough that it allowed the PC market to either stay flat or grow a little bit this year, where other PC sales had kind of fallen by the wayside. It's possible that businesses evaluating this product have said, look, there are things we really like about this. It's lightweight, it's super secure, it's reliable, it's easy to update. But we really like this relationship we have with Microsoft. We like the things that Microsoft does for us with regards to single sign-on across the Microsoft stack and all the back-end services they have and blah, blah, whatever it is. Is there something like this you guys are planning? Because, there are certain users, especially today, who are going to need like a full-size, full speed, full performance Windows 10 PC. But there are a lot of user groups who don't need that. And increasingly, especially with millennials, I would say people coming out of college, the way that people work is really changing. And there is no longer, I think, this coming generation of people that grew up on PowerPoint and Word and Outlook, and they don't need or care about or want these things. They want more modern, lightweight tools. And they can get that stuff in some ways in the Apple ecosystem. They can get some of that stuff in the Android or Chrome OS ecosystem. And Microsoft is dabbling in it, Teams and so forth. But maybe there is a call for this. And I think that's the thing that would make it make sense. Right.
So when we say Chrome OS competitor, Chromebook competitor, a lot of people are like, oh, you mean the education market? No, what you're making the point.
No.
And I think you're totally right.
No, not education.
First line workers, right, is who you're talking about. These people who are in self-service, people who work at the counter, they used to call them deskless workers, right? So they need something that's like locked down, simple, sometimes just locked down to one app, like in kiosk mode or whatever. But something that the company controls and constrains. And that's what this could be, right?
Education customers might want this too, I guess. But I really, I don't think that's that's the call. I don't think that was the call they got. The problem with the education market is they don't have any money. So the fact that it is of some size and whatever, you have to kind of respect it, because I feel like these people represent future customers. And so if my kids all grew up as they did using Google services on a Chromebook or something, that's going to impact their worldview going forward. And when they get out into the workforce, those are the things they're going to expect to use. And so you have to kind of be careful of that part of it. But you also have to look at where the money's coming from. And I'm just speculating, but I think it makes sense that business, the enterprise essentially has come to Microsoft and said, look, we really like this stuff we get over here. What you've offered us is Windows 10S, which is a joke. Is there something else you can do that makes more sense than this? And I want to be super clear, speculating here, guessing, whatever you want to call it, but that's the only thing to me that makes this make sense.
Mm-hmm.
So would it run on a computer, a laptop that would be the same price as a Chromebook?
Yeah, I think that has to be the point, that this thing is lightweight in the sense that it requires less hardware and would be less expensive. I think that's part of the point, right? Microsoft is pushing this always connected PC initiative. There will probably be Intel and ARM variants of it. Something more lightweight would make it run better on those ARM chips, by the way. That's kind of a problem we see today with Windows 10 on ARM, especially in the first generation. And we'll see how that, improves over time. But, so far that's been an issue. And there's also a compatibility issue on ARM, right? And also with Windows 10S, right? These things don't run, either don't run desktop applications or don't run all desktop applications or don't run them well, right? There's a performance issue. So if you kind of create this thing that isn't called Windows, it doesn't look like Windows, it doesn't quack like Windows, whatever. And there's a apps platform that makes sense, maybe, and so what is that app platform that makes sense? It has to be web apps, certainly, progressive web apps especially. The question is, does it include store apps? And if so, what subset of store apps, right? Because store apps today are all kinds of things. Will this thing run, Adobe Photoshop Elements is in the store. That's a desktop app. It's in a container, an app package, whatever you want to call it. Will that run on it? I mean, no. Because if it does, that would be incredible. I don't.
So if Lite is based on this thing we keep talking about called Windows Core OS, WCOS, which we think it may be. So Windows Core OS, first, I should say, is like the successor to what Microsoft tried with Windows 1 Core. It's the idea of taking like the most stripped down part of Windows and making it common across all the different form factors that run Windows. So if it is WCOS, and if Lite's based on that, which I think it probably is, there have been rumors that Microsoft might use containers, VMs, or some kind of virtualization scheme to allow different classes of apps to run on it, even if they're not in the store. So say you could have Win32 apps running on this, but containerized only or virtualized only.
This is what I've been begging for years.
Yep.
The other thing is, just from kind of a naming perspective, I feel like this came up on the show recently, but remember years ago, Microsoft used to have something called Windows Media Player for Mac, right? Terrible name. Nobody on the Mac would ever want to run a Microsoft Media Player, but once you put the Windows name on the front of it, this becomes the dumbest thing in the world. Yeah. Well, Microsoft, like Google, has been kind of rebranding a lot of their products as Microsoft, not as Windows something. Remember, everything was Windows something in the past.
Yeah.
Windows Azure is one of the great examples, and that goes back several years now. It is perhaps not coincidental that the store that serves Windows and the Xbox is now called the Microsoft Store, not the Windows Store. Because we've already introduced this notion that this store can go to non-Windows platforms like Xbox. So whatever this thing is called, it doesn't matter what the name is, it running apps, if Microsoft could say this thing runs apps from the Microsoft Store, that there's no disconnect there, right? It to any normal person that, without any understanding of the technical underpinnings of these systems would say, yeah, okay, great. That makes sense.
Right. You wouldn't have the word Windows, right, is what your point is.
Right, because once you introduce the word Windows, it gets to be a weird problem.
It does.
Because when you hear Windows, you think, it's going to run everything that Windows runs. And I we'll see, but I don't know how that could be the case.
Yeah. I'm also curious if it really looks really different, like what does it look like? I mean, does it look like Windows at all? Does it look more like Chrome OS? What does it look like, right? This Lite thing, if it ever comes to market. Like, what's the UI look like, you know?
It probably looks like Chrome OS.
Well, it seems like it would be good to make it look like Windows, because I think I don't know if this is.
See, that's I'm sorry to interrupt, but I mean that's the problem, right? So Windows RT looked like Windows, but it couldn't run Windows applications.
Right,
Windows
that's what got people crazed, right? Like they're like, no, it's Windows.
We're almost at like an interesting intersection of time where the Windows thing is more of a detriment than a positive, right? Like. Microsoft has data to this effect. They're probably not talking about it a lot, but I feel like Microsoft understands that their brand really does resonate, that they're a trusted tech company. They may not be on quite as far up the scale as Apple when it comes to like privacy and trust or whatever, but they're way closer to that than they are to Amazon or Google or Facebook for sure. And that they can ride that kind of brand success by coming out with like, this is a Microsoft device running a Microsoft system that runs Microsoft Store apps and everything that's great about the web, And again, I'm not. Don't get me wrong. I am at least skeptical along the lines of this thing and how how it could be successful. But that stands more of a chance than we have this thing called Microsoft Edge, and nobody likes it. But we're going to make a version of Chrome OS that runs off of our web browser, and it runs store apps. Like that's a ridiculous note. Oh, we're going to call it Windows something too. Windows 10 Lite.
Windows 10 Edge OS.
It's everything you can't stand about Windows 10, but less. Like it's just not. That's a non-starter. So I guess all I'm suggesting is I don't know what they're going to call this if it even happens, whatever. But I think it not being called Windows actually in this case makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, I feel like I get a lot of questions, from people who watch these shows and also from. Just general people in my life. Like, I just need a new laptop and I'm not going to run anything. I'm not going to even run Photoshop. Like, the only app I want, and they wouldn't even call it that, is Microsoft Word, and so like those are people who aren't even used to Google Docs. Like, you can convince them like this is okay, but it's people that, their whole work life, they've mostly used Windows and they just want a laptop and everyone says buy a Mac and they say, I do not want to pay $1,500. I want to, and Chromebooks are uncomfortable to those people sometimes. Mm-hmm.
The nice thing about Microsoft Office is that it's called Microsoft Office and not Windows Office. And if they could get that thing to run on this, which of course they would, because that's job one for Microsoft. Right. I think that's key. The other thing that's happening right now is that we're transitioning Office from this kind of full ribbon interface, that one-way dead-end road that Steven Sinofsky put in place back in 2007 or whatever that was, where users didn't have a choice. They had to go to this new interface, right? And so now as they're transitioning to a smaller ribbon called the simplified ribbon, which is really just a toolbar with a tab bar on the top of it. You're going to get the choice to go back and forth between the two UIs. So if you like the bigger UI, you can have it. If you need those features, that's fine. But this new thing, I think, looks better and makes more sense on these mobile devices, right? On kind of a real estate constrained device like a tablet or whatever. You can see it now on the web, by the way. If you go to Office Online, Word Online has this new UI. And if you put it side by side with Word, whatever they're calling it now, 2019 or whatever, the version you get with Office 365, I mean, to me, this web thing looks way more modern, and it has everything most people would need by default. You don't have to go diving through menus to find anything. If they can get that working as a progressive web app, which I think should be job one for those guys, and make that work on this system, which of course it will, then there you go. This is a Chromebook that runs Microsoft Word, I'm
going to be a Debbie Downer. I'm going to take your role over for a minute. Okay. You know what we haven't heard about at all? Progressive web app version of Office. Like, for a while we were kind of hearing about that, and it's just stopped. Like, we're not hearing about that anymore.
So you're not being a Debbie Downer. Honestly, what you might be hinting at here really is this strategy change we're seeing now with Edge. In other words, I know from talking to those guys last year that they did go to the Office team and they did talk to them about this, and that they were very positive.
They told you that, right?
This is
they
happening.
Actually said it to you.
It is very possible that part of this change away from Edge HTML has to do with the fact that stuff is actually way harder, because these guys are like, guys, the point of progressive web apps is that I write it once and it works everywhere. But actually what we have to do is write it once for our stuff, once for Chrome, once for Firefox, or whatever it might be. And we need to make this simpler. This might literally have been the inspiration or part of it for what we're seeing now.
Yeah, could be. Yep.
Again, Microsoft's developers, like any other developers, they're going to benefit from having a single target that they have to work to, rather than having multiple versions. And in the future, you could extrapolate this further. I mean, why have native versions of let's just use Word for Windows and the Mac when you can write one version that works awesome everywhere, looks the same? That benefits Microsoft way more than having to do all that work with different teams, sometimes in different places, targeting different platforms, using different tools and languages and SDK, all the nonsense you have to deal with. So this may literally, again, it ties nicely into the whole Satya Nadella thing. I mean, we're gonna sink or swim, I guess, based on this thing. But I think it all makes sense. So therefore, it's never going to happen. But it does make.
No, I mean, the thing to remember in the org chart, right, is who's making a lot of decisions about Windows right now. Okay, there's on the engineering side, it's the Azure team under Jason Zander. But on the other side, the experiences part and devices, it's Rajesh Jha. Rajesh Jha used to run Office only at Microsoft, so he now runs Microsoft 365 and a lot of other things. But what is he when he thinks about things? I'm sure he thinks Office first, right? And so, like you're saying,
but you know what? I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's very interesting what you just said. He used to run Microsoft 365. What is Microsoft 365?
Right,
it's
Office,
Windows 365, but it's it's running on everything. It's that stuff running on everything, right?
Yep.
And when you come up out of a mentality where this thing needs to work great on iOS, it needs to work great on Android, it has to work on the web, it has to work on Windows, it has to work on Mac. You've just introduced an incredible amount of complexity. Just use Word as the one example, one of probably dozens of examples of things that have to run on multiple platforms. It is not something that they can probably do right now. I mean, Word for Windows is an incredibly complex application. It may not be something they could literally do ever, but as a goal to get there and make this thing as the same as possible across all those platforms, use the same core. It's kind of like the one core thing, except applied to multi-platform and applied to an application stack instead of the operating system.
Yeah, very true.
Why is it so complicated? Why is Word for Windows so complicated?
Well,
just
first
like
of all,
Windows,
it's 30 years old.
I know.
I mean,
I was going to say, just like Windows, it's this giant hairball of code, right? That's all was coded in different ways, and they've tried to separate out parts of it now and make it cross-platform by separating out those parts. It's a mess.
You got to remember, by the time Microsoft developed Longhorn or tried to, Windows had gotten so big and so unwieldy that the old way of creating the project no longer worked. That's why that thing failed. They had all these project groups who were working separately, plugging their code into the OS, and they could never get it to, compile is a simplified way of saying it, but they could never get it to work. And they realized that this old system they had been using literally for decades had just broken. It wasn't working anymore. They had to start over from scratch.
I told the story, I think, before on the show when I went into Jim Alchin's office area at Microsoft, and they had this chart. Or it was like a diagram of what Windows was with all the subsystems. It was like multiple floors. Like it was hanging from the ceiling down past the second floor and the first floor. And I was like, what is that? And they're like, that's Windows.
That's how Windows is architected. It looks it looks like a map of the universe. Yeah.
Yeah, it did. It did.
So, I mean, since then, there's been a lot of work, and actually during that as well, but there's been a lot of work over the past, 15 years to componentize Windows. And the one core effort now, CoreOS, is an idea that you kind of apply layers on top of layers, and you get a more complete and more complex system. But the problem for Windows proper, Windows 10 as we know it, Windows on PCs, is that it is the most complex stack of that stuff imaginable. And a lot of that code dates back literally decades. And Word for Windows and Office is just as old. Excel was the first Office app. It was developed first on the Mac, but the Windows version dates back, I think, to the mid-'80s or the very late 80s. Word does as well. PowerPoint, it was an acquisition, I think, from the early 90s. These things are all, it's just legacy, lots of legacy there,
Yeah.
And the problem is there's also a user base. We just made this argument ourselves, or I have anyway, like I've said that Windows isn't Windows unless it runs Windows apps. Well, that's the problem. You got people like me who have these expectations because they've been using Windows, or in this case, Office, for such a long time. You can't take features out, because every single goofy little feature in Office could be used by one person, but that's the feature they have to have. It's why they don't switch to Google Docs or don't go to a text editor or whatever, and this is a huge problem. It's kind of kept Microsoft afloat for a while, but it also creates this complexity where they can never really move forward. Apple is always very aggressive about dropping stuff, and Microsoft's always very tentative about it because every time they try to do anything, it's like the French trying to raise gasoline tax by a penny. The entire country went on strike. That's what Microsoft's user base is like. We're the French.
No, it's true. It's true. OneNote's a great example, right? Microsoft's trying to move everybody onto modern OneNote, which is the UWP version. But there's always this group of people who are like, no, I need that one feature that's in the desktop version, and I don't want to go to the modern version because I need that one thing. And then they're like, yeah, okay. Especially if you work for a big enterprise and everybody in your company is using it, Microsoft's not going to just bend and go, okay, we're going to just dump you. No, they have to support you as a legacy customer. Yeah.
OneNote's a great example because OneNote is, until Teams, I would say, is the most recent, popular Office application, right? And by recent, we're talking, I think they first announced it in 2001, 2002 at the latest. It probably first shipped with Office 2003. And anyway, here we go. So it's kind of evolved over the years. So it's not as old as the other stuff. It's 20 years newer. And yet just today, for example, I'm working on the show notes for this. I'm using the modern version of OneNote. And I want to paste in something from my website. And I don't want it to be formatted like my website's formatted. I want it as text. And there's an option for that in the normal versions of OneNote. But in the modern version, what I have to do is, because of course I pasted in wrong. I'm like, wow, God, what is wrong with this thing? You have to right click, find a menu, find a sub menu off of that, and then choose as text or whatever it says. I can't do it right now, but I literally just today was like, screw this thing. I want the thing I'm used to. Like, why isn't it the same? And I literally had this kind of internal thing where I was like, you know what? I got to just learn to deal with this. It's not a big deal. I don't paste stuff into OneNote all that much. We work on these notes like once a week, basically. It's not like a lifestyle. What were you trying
to put in there? Were you trying to put a picture in there or something?
No. It's just like a description or something. Like, in other words, because you know how it works. If you pull something off the web and paste it, it puts the URL in small text. I hate that. So what I want to do is paste these plain text. Right. Well, you have these kind of workflow things. Yeah. Well, now extrapolate me to 1.5 billion people. Every one of them has this stupid, one thing that they love, that they rely on, and you can't say no to those people.
I know.
It's hard.
Well, we've got a lot more to talk about. Centaurus.
Centaurus.
Yeah, Centaurus, Xbox Surface. But you guys need to take a breath for a minute. We got to take a drink of water so we can thank our sponsor.
Check my blood pressure.
Check your blood pressure. Deep breaths, Paul. We're going to talk about PRILOCK, which is our sponsor, and that's like privacy lock. If you have ever read anything about breaches, you probably know that many of them started with a phishing email, just someone going about their day and getting an email, replying to it too quickly, or just they're just not thinking that someone is trying to fool them. PRILOCK Security offers a best-of-breed security training platform that can automatically create, enroll, manage, deliver, track, and report your phishing tests and security briefings. In most cases, you'll pay up to 70% less than comparable programs. PRILOCK's state-of-the-art platform uses the latest advances from Amazon Web Services, creating substantial cost savings, which PRILOCK will pass on to you. With PRILOCK's one-click setup, you can create a full year's training that's for 50 or 5,000 employees. You can do that in less than a minute, and you won't need an IT professional at all. It includes a 3-day baseline phishing test, a custom user page for each employee that's loaded with resources, security awareness training that's taught by a hacker and includes gamification, and a 10-question final assessment for compliance mandates. They will schedule and run 24 additional random fish tests throughout the year. So it's not like just a one-time deal. They'll be testing constantly, really to train up your employees. They will think differently about their email. You can automatically enroll clickers in specific injection training videos if they click too much. They will also email a report to admin and reports analytics in real time 24/7. Experienced IT pros can use PRILOCK's advanced setup for granular control over key aspects of their phishing campaigns, build industry-specific fish, or use PRILOCK's growing library of over 600 of the most effective fish training emails currently used to con your employees. There's some really good ones. They can trick even the most seasoned employees, and it's good. It's good. Once you've been tricked, you are not tricked again. Some of PRILOCK's unique features are effective security training on the psychology used by hackers, not a list of do's and don'ts. Fish tests include open fish, clicked links, downloaded attachments, enabled macros, and data entered for credential theft. Full analytics allows a deep dive into every user, fish, and click. Send a friend a fish allows users to send a friend or a colleague a fish and a learning page to show them what they might have missed. If you find this kind of thing fun, then check it out. I sort of do. It's nice to be able to see who you can trick and who you can't. PRILOCK offers 1-year security programs for companies as small as 25 employees for $395. If you're worried about your mom, your dad, your grandparents, or even a special friend, PRILOCK offers a single license gift card that will test them with 2 fish tests a month for a full year. You will never, ever learn all the ways hackers can con and trick you. Let PRILOCK show your employees the psychology used against them so they aren't the next victim. Learn more at prilock.com/twit. Make sure to use the promo code LEO and you can save 30%. That's prilock.com/twit, promo code LEO. And we thank PRILOCK for their support of Windows Weekly.
I'm going to send Mary Jo a fish. I think her cat would like that.
Yes.
Don't give him any more incentives to be a bad boy.
All right. Centaurus, the dual screen.
Actually, before we get to that real quick, I added this kind of late, but related to those 2 previous topics, right? Microsoft Edge and moving to Chromium. And again, and Windows 10 Lite, which is kind of a Chrome OS competitor. That is kind of, we'll call it not Windows. I feel like these are 2 things that could never have happened under Terry Myerson, right? And and this is kind of awkward for me because I love Terry. Terry was a refutation of the the kind of secretive ways of Steven Sinofsky, his predecessor, and a return to the more open and transparent Microsoft of Jim Olchin, who Mary Jo mentioned earlier. I was just researching some stuff related to the early days of Surface, and I was going through my archives, and I found all this stuff about Jim Olchin, which I had completely forgotten about, and what an awesome guy he was, and how open he was. He would have dinner with us, and we'd go and meet him at the campus. He'd come out and tour, and we'd go see him, and God, do I miss that guy. Anyway.
Wait, are you talking about Jim Olchin?
Jim Olchin, yeah. Yeah, you didn't have a good relationship with Jim.
He and I had a little different relationship, but go on.
Oh, I had a great relationship with him. I miss that guy. But I had a great relationship with Terry, too.
No, I liked him. I liked Jim Olchin. Yeah. And Terry, I agree with you. He was way more open to us.
Yeah, him leaving hit me hard. And, I wrote about that at the time and talked about it. But one of the things I really liked about Terry was that under Steven Sinofsky, anyone who was not kind of with him, was against him. And that included people inside of Microsoft. And he alienated, I would say, about 95% of Microsoft against Windows at the time. And one of the things he did that I thought was really crappy was he kind of pushed aside the Windows Phone folks. He stole everything he needed from them to do like live tells and everything. And then he never worked with them ever again. And they just kind of badly implemented Windows Phone features in Windows 8 without any sense of these things working together. And so it was kind of cool to me that Terry Myerson, who came up out of the Windows Phone team, the B-teamers, as the Windows guys would have called them at the time, took over and ran Windows, and I thought that was cool. I really thought that was cool. And yet, I look at this stuff now. I look at remember some of the stuff that was controversial with Terry, like Terry was never going to allow Google Chrome in the store, for example. He was never going to work with those guys, right? I think he was a big part of the reason they have kind of an adversarial relationship. He was a strong promoter of Windows, but I think ultimately, I look at some of this stuff now, and I look at some of the stuff they're doing now, and understanding that it would never could have happened under him. It's causing me to kind of rethink things a little bit, because it's possible that his openness and transparency kind of biased my view of what was happening with the company, And again, I don't know. There's a weird headless nature to Windows now. Mary Jo mentioned earlier how the engineering is under one team and one guy, and the user experience stuff is under this other team, and they don't have anyone in the senior leadership team representing Windows anymore, which I think is tragic and hard to understand. And yet, you see stuff like this, and you're like, boy, why couldn't this had happened 3-4 years ago?
One reason I think it couldn't have, and I agree with you, a lot of it was Terry Myerson and kind of what he brought to the party and how he thought about things, having been at Microsoft so long. But I think things have changed too. Like now that Windows is less important to Microsoft, I mean, it still makes them a ton of money, but they're kind of pushing it down in terms of priorities. I think now they're like, okay, let's do things that make sense instead of let's try to preserve the fortress around Windows,
I actually think the reason Terry left is because this was happening, that Satya Nadella basically said, look, what you just described is happening. It's less important. We're not going to pour all this money and resources and people at this stuff anymore.
Yep.
And by the way, you guys are not doing the whole Microsoft thing now. I don't know if you noticed, this is a new Microsoft. We work with other people. We're friendly. We partner. We embrace open standards, whatever. And Terry didn't want any part of that, because Terry was on the senior leadership team. Terry had a major leadership role at the company. He was a public face for a very important part of Microsoft, and a diminished Windows group where he might not have even been in charge of it and might have had to find a job elsewhere at the company. It was probably not of a bunch of interest to him, And Terry certainly improved in some positive ways because of Satya Nadella. He talked about some of the changes he made to his personal life and so forth. We don't need to get into that, but I think, like you said, I think he was old Microsoft. I think when I said this is part of Microsoft that thinks we still have to do everything because we're Microsoft and that's what we do. That's Terry. That is Terry. Terry had been at Microsoft for almost 20 years or whatever, or more than 20 years, whatever. That's the old mentality at Microsoft, and there aren't really a lot of those guys left, at least not in what I would call leadership positions. If you look at the senior leadership team, you look at the people who are running Microsoft's various business units. That's not who they are. A lot of them are guys that came to the company fairly recently, either through acquisitions or just from outside the company or whatever. It's a different place. And so I'm not trying to dump on Terry. I don't mean it like that. Terry is a product of his generation and of that Microsoft. It's not, whatever. But I think Terry leaving in some ways, it isn't necessarily why this happened, but it's part of that wave of change that was happening, this wasn't going to happen under a Terry Myerson-led Windows team.
Yeah, agree. I do agree.
So are we ready for Chapter 3 in the Chromebook compete strategy?
The rumors thing? Yeah.
Right. Chromebook killer, we nailed it.
So Mary Jo, Microsoft Centaurus, you wrote about this device. It's a dual screen foldable device.
Yeah, remember Courier? Remember what that prototype looked like that Microsoft never brought to market? It was a dual screen device that looked like a journal, folded it in half, and you could flick things from one side to the other, and it would just magically appear on the other screen. It had a pen. This sounds a lot like what the Centaurus thing is. So if you remember, Brad and I both had heard that after Andromeda, Microsoft was still thinking about dual screen devices, but not the size of Andromeda, which was supposed to be almost like a small phone. And we both had heard something bigger, a bigger screened foldable device was what is next. So Windows Central got the code name, which is Centaurus, which makes sense because Andromeda and Centaurus are both galaxies, I believe. So they're in the Galaxy codename group. I've had people talk about this to me and say it basically is a lot like Courier. It's meant to be something small, but not tiny, something more like a journal. We don't know exactly, what the specs will be or how big it will be. We also don't know if it will ever come to market. Andromeda made it way long along the development pipeline before they decided we don't have a good value proposition for this thing. And I have to say, reading the bits and hearing the bits I have about Centaurus, I'm like, okay, what is the value proposition for this thing?
I don't understand it. The way Brad described this was that, there's a screen like you have with like a tablet. Then there's you can attach a keyboard, but you could also attach another screen. And I'm like, that's fascinating. What is the point of that? What exactly is how are we selling this? What's the benefit of that?
Right. And so if you think about it as a Chromebook competitor, which I've heard people say that's what it's intended to be, you have to wonder about it, right? Because it's going to be expensive if it's a Surface branded device. They're not going to cut corners. It's going to be pricey. The keyboard would be separate. Maybe the other screen would cost additional. The pen will cost something additional. And they're not hardened devices, right? I mean, you can't give these to kids, even though they give the Surface Go. They're trying to sell the Surface Go as for children, K through 12 especially. These things aren't really hardened like Chromebooks, and I don't know. I'm like, okay, it looks cool. Everybody loved the Courier design. Everybody wanted to see it come to market, but it never did, partially because it was expensive. And I think you got to go back to the idea of, okay, what is this thing for that you currently can't do either on your phone or on a tablet? Like, why would you have this device? What's the purpose of this third screen, basically? Yeah. That's what we don't know.
Yeah, it's not really a rhetorical question either. It's not. This is a conversation we have a lot because obviously in any enthusiast space, there are people who are like, oh, they should make that. That'd be really cool.
I know.
Yeah, okay, but what? Yeah, okay, sure. But what's the point of it?
Yeah.
Like, what's the? It has to have an advantage or a benefit over what's currently available.
Yep.
And
again,
I look at this thing and I don't get it.
No, and the old Microsoft, they would have just made it, right? They would have been like, yeah, let's do it. We can do it. Let's do it. And under the new Satya Nadella Microsoft, I think you go before somebody, maybe the senior leadership team, the board, somebody, and you're like, okay, here's this thing. And they're like, okay, why?
Yeah, they're like, what does it do? And like, it's really cool.
You can use a pen with it. Yeah, you can use a pen with Surface. You can use a pen with Surface Go. I mean, like it has to have something that is a must-have feature. And maybe we just don't know what it is and there is something, but I'm like, okay, what's it for?
It's a good question.
Yeah. I don't know if it'll ever come to market. Windows Central said they were hearing, and Brad also said the target was latter half of 2019, which to me seems really soon. But again, maybe there are pieces of this we don't know.
You mentioned that Andromeda had been in the development pipeline for a long time, and I feel like there's a thing going on with the Surface team where they're like, look, you killed Surface Mini, you won't let us release Andromeda, you got to let us do this one. And it's like, yeah, that's not how this works. Like it still has to make sense. And they've obviously been pushing for some kind of a small form factor or something for a long time. And I look at each of those things and I just think, yeah, this is not something you should be selling. It doesn't really.
No, you look at it and the mock-ups are so cool, right? And you're like, oh, that looks so cool.
That's
and
really
like, but what would I use it for?
Yeah. Would it not run the same apps?
I know. I've had people say, well, if I had that, I wouldn't need to carry a phone, a tablet, and a PC. I could just carry that one thing. Well, we don't know if it's going to have telephony capabilities. I mean, it could be an LTE device. I would assume it would be an LTE device. But again, like, okay, would that replace your phone though?
Is there an LTE device on Earth that replaces your phone? What are you talking about? An always connected PC doesn't replace your phone.
It doesn't. Right.
I used to back. I mean, I don't remember what the time frame was for this, but back when PDAs were still a thing, I remember I went to Comdex, or I'd go to these trade shows, and to look at my schedule, I'd have to either have printed it out or open up my giant laptop, wait for Windows to spin up and load, look at the thing, find out where I was going, close it, go to where I hoped that was, couldn't find it, open the thing up. And so I bought this little thing called a Rex, and it had a tiny little screen. It was just like a PDA sync thing, and it would just have my stuff on it, like contacts and whatever. And it wasn't instead of a phone, it wasn't instead of a computer, but it was just like this additional extra little device. And it was nice because it would fit in your wallet. It was the size of a credit card. And I could pull it out and say, this is where I have to go. That device makes more sense than these things. Like, this is pre, cellular connectivity or whatever, but I don't know. I know they keep trying. They'll get there someday.
Yeah. All right, the path ahead for Xbox. Brad wrote about this. What is the path ahead for
Xbox and Surface? So, like, as part of Brad's book came out last week,
Under the Surface
and
beneath the surface,
beneath a surface,
beneath a surface. Okay.
Yep. Oh boy. I spent a rough month of my life editing that book, and it's worth reading. I think, like I've said before, people who are fans of this show, especially or websites, whatever, will be interested in this story. But in the book are some interesting kind of future-leaning things. In many ways, actually, kind of reminds me. Mary Jo wrote a book, Microsoft 2.0. Is that it, or 3.0? 2.0.
That was 2.0. Yep.
And one of the things that was intriguing, that I think is still intriguing about that book, is you can kind of go back and look at it, and the Microsoft world has completely changed again since then. Mm-hmm. And you can kind of look at some of the forward-leaning stuff and see how that has happened. And so Brad's book has a little bit of that in it. And among those things are some of the stuff that's going on with Microsoft hardware in the near and long-term future. So Xbox and Surface. So Xbox specifically, we know that Microsoft is moving toward a model where it's game streaming, heterogeneous devices, not just consoles, not just PCs, but we need to get there first. And so they are in fact planning to update the consoles again. And if I understand this correctly, it looks like they're going to be pulling what I would call another Xbox One X for the next device, meaning they're going to basically have a compatible console to existing consoles, same games, same services, et cetera, but ramp up the performance yet again. And so the goal for the next Xbox is true 60 frame per second, actual 4K graphics across the board, not just hit that sometimes, which is what the current consoles do. So that's cool. And then and also I should say, based on AMD, which is kind of interesting. One of the conversations I'd had with Terry a year or two ago was about Intel and his worry that they were dominating the PC platform. It's one of the reasons they're working with Qualcomm now, Windows 10 for ARM. It's interesting that the Xbox is based on AMD hardware. Surface Laptop might be based on AMD hardware starting this next year. And that's kind of interesting because we got a very kind of mild update to Surface Laptop this year. It looks like the next one will be kind of a bigger deal. And it might not even be based on Intel chips, which I think might in some ways be a positive. The next Surface Studio is going to utilize a modular design similar to what they're doing for the new Surface Hub 2. And what that means is you'll have a compute module that you can kind of unplug and plug back in. And you can also take the screen off and plug it into a different computer if you want. And modular PCs are not unusual in the industry, but they don't have such a thing in the Surface lineup for now. So I think that's kind of interesting. And what he's saying is that detachable screen is probably the closest we're ever going to get to a Surface display, which is something a lot of people have asked for. But when you look at a Surface Studio today, a $3,000 or $4,000 device, 2/3 of the cost of that thing is the screen. And so replacing the compute part of it is not a big deal and not super expensive. It's something that Surface Hub 2 will be able to do. It's something that apparently the future Surface Studio will be able to do. And there's some other stuff. But anyway, you can go to the site to read the whole thing. But he's got kind of neat roadmaps there for the next year or two for both Xbox and Surface.
All right, moving on to Microsoft Connect Roundup. But before we move on there, I'm going to thank our sponsor for this show, Rocket Mortgage. If you are in the market for a home, you know that it can cause some anxiety. If you're even thinking about buying a house, it's good to prepare. I always think the more you prepare for something, the less anxiety you have. And that's why I want to recommend Rocket Mortgage by Quicken Loans. Rising interest rates are always rising or falling. There's a lot of unpredictability when it comes to buying a house. And our friends at Quicken Loans are doing something about it. They're calling it the Power Buying Process, and it has 3 steps, 3 very easy steps. You just answer a few very simple questions, and they're easy. You probably know the answer, and they'll check your credit for pre-qualified approval. Step 2, Quicken Loans will verify your income, your assets, and your credit. And that only takes around 24 hours, sometimes a lot less than 24 hours. And then they will give you a verified approval. And when you're verified, that means you get the strength of a cash buyer. So if you've ever bought a house and then someone else has come in with cash and just swooped it out from under you, I think a lot of us probably have that dream house that there was a cash buyer that came in and the person selling the house says to you, oh, I'm sorry, they had cash. And you're just like, oh, how did they have cash? Well, if you do this, you will have that same strength, the same superpowers that a cash buyer has. And step 3, once you're verified, you qualify for their all-new exclusive Rate Shield approval. What that means is they will lock up your rate for up to 90 days. That way you can shop around, look for your dream house. And then if the rates go up while you're shopping around in those 90 days, your rate will stay the same. It won't go up. And if the rates go down, your rate also drops. So you win either way, which is nice. And it's this is just kind of the thinking you'd expect from America's largest mortgage lender. They have a lot of experience. If you want to get started, if this sounds good to you, if you're thinking about buying a house anytime soon, open up your web browser, whether it be Edge or Explorer or something else named E. Go to rocketmortgage.com/windows. Rate Shield approval is only valid on certain 30-year purchase transactions. Additional conditions or exclusions may apply based on Quicken Loans data in comparison to public data records. Equal housing lender licensed in all 50 states. NMLS consumeraccess.org, number 3030. That's rocketmortgage.com/windows. Don't forget to add the windows. That way they know that you came to them through Windows Weekly. That's rocketmortgage.com/windows. And we thank Rocket Mortgage by Quicken Loans for their support of Windows Weekly. All right, Microsoft Connect Roundup. What does that mean?
It's more exciting than it sounds.
Okay, Microsoft Connect Roundup.
Yep.
Yeah, so Microsoft Connect, it's got Connect and then 2 parentheses and a semicolon. That's the official way they spell it.
So Connect with a C, not Connect with a K.
Correct.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Correct. This is their annual developer conference. They used to have this in New York City and then broadcast it virtually. This year, I think it was in Vegas, and they broadcast it virtually. That's why we weren't there this year, Vegas. But they still had a ton of really interesting announcements. And I think the most interesting and kind of surprising one, I'm curious if Paul agrees, is Microsoft open sourcing WPF, WinForms, and WinUI.
Yeah.
Did you think that was
I
was surprised.
Here's the thing. This ties neatly into the stuff we were talking about earlier, this kind of new Microsoft, right? So
True. Yeah.
This was a company that was pushing modern developer SDKs and APIs and Windows 10 only stuff on developers for years. And what's really happening out in the world is that developers are using WPF and WinForms and WinUI, I guess, to develop Windows apps that work on every version of Windows, right? Not just on Windows 10. And, it was that one-way dead-end road aspect of UWP in the WinStore and Windows 10 that I think turned off developers. It was kind of just a brain-dead strategy. And I think this is in many ways for developers what that other stuff we were talking about earlier is for for Windows users, I guess, right? And to be clear, the thing that's confusing about this is you kind of hear this, you're like, okay, so why? What would like? What's the point of this? Like, they're not bringing WPF or WinForms or WinUI to the Mac or to Linux or anything like that, right? But what these things will do is run on top of .NET Core, which is the .NET Core 3 or newer, I guess, the open source newish version of the .NET framework. The .NET platform, I guess we could call it. That thing, I should say, .NET Core does run on Linux and the Mac, right? But the one thing they changed, I want to say with 2.0 was they started developing platform-specific features to meet the needs, again, of developers. Because there were a lot of .NET Stack developers who were like, hold on a second, guys. Like, there's stuff that we need on Windows that doesn't apply to this other stuff. So you're saying it's not going to be in .NET Core because, it didn't really make any sense. And so the way this works is, this stuff will work with .NET Core 3.0 on Windows only, right? So that makes sense because these are legacy Windows technologies essentially. And the open source nature of it and putting it up in GitHub so that people can look at the source code and comment on it and ask for feature changes and so forth is really just a way to engage that audience, And so when you think about, Windows 10, for example, we have an insider program, and that's for enthusiasts because that's they have a business version as well. And that's how you engage with those guys. The way you engage with developers basically is on GitHub. And so this is a way to have a community around these projects so that they can ask for changes or point out problems or whatever it is and contribute to the success of these platforms. And on that note, my initial reaction was like, what? And then you kind of read about it and you're like, oh, okay. Yeah, no, that's cool.
Yeah. I had some people say, oh yeah, they put it in open source because it means they're done with it and they don't care what happens to it. No, that's actually not true.
No.
They still care a lot.
Yeah, no, the next year is going to be very interesting. When you look at the changes that have occurred, especially very recently, but this year, let's say, there has been a real kind of re-embrace of what their audience is actually doing, right? In this case, we're talking about developers and the technologies they're actually using, right? Microsoft is really on the cusp of losing a major audience here if they don't start paying attention to the needs of that audience, And they've been kind of ham-handedly jamming this Windows 10 stuff down their throats for a while. And I think this is basically them. It's not the only thing they've done along these lines, but when they look at these technologies in particular, there's been a real about face on that and saying, hold on a second, we got to stop moving forward here. When the entire community is not coming with us, we're obviously doing something wrong.
Yep.
And again, I think it's kind of a Satya Nadella thing.
Yeah. It was funny when they announced this yesterday at Connect, I had somebody tweet to me, I'm in the middle of teaching a course right now about WinForms and WPF. And I just said to my class 1 minute ago, well, these are interesting, but they'll never open source these. And then I just saw your tweet.
That's awesome.
So, yeah, I think everybody was pretty surprised in a good way. And I think them adding support for this to .NET Core 3 shows, okay, we hear you. We were making a mistake and we're going back and fixing it. So
just really from the perspective of acceptance of .NET Core 3, if you're not running these very popular, I'm not sure what to call these things, platforms, these
frameworks.
are kind of frameworks there. On your new thing, you're running into the same situation you ran into with UWP in the Windows Store. The developers are just going to stick with the old thing, which in this case is the .NET framework, the Windows only version of the thing. Well, Microsoft wants you to move forward. Well, how do they do that? Well, you support the thing that people are actually using. So again, it's just pragmatic and smart.
Agree. And then the next announcement, it wasn't a surprise, but I think a lot of the features that are in it were good things from a developer's perspective. And we're talking about Visual Studio 2019. The first preview came out this week. And if you were watching Connect, they did really extensive demos of all the different things that are in the first public preview. They incorporated Visual Studio Live Share, which is that coding collaboration service, right into Visual Studio 2019, which I think a lot of people were happy about. They're making it easier to work with Git repositories, whether they're on GitHub or Azure or other places. They have a new pull request experience. Like there's a lot of things that are meant to make your life as a developer, if you use Visual Studio, easier, to make it easier and faster for you to get right into coding. And because that's a big complaint with Visual Studio is, I like it, but it takes so long to get to my project and it just takes forever. And so they're fixing that with a new start menu and a new start experience. There were a lot lot in that demo. I was like, okay.
About the timing for the final release, it seems to me that they've often released Visual Studio in November. So the fact that they just announced the preview now says to me maybe this spring.
I think next year sometime, obviously because of the name, but not sure when. They didn't say when. They said they'll have more to say as they issue more previews in the future about how much it'll cost, what the SKUs will be, and all that. But they didn't say exactly when it would come out.
Yeah, I bet it's before build.
Or around that time, I would think. Yeah. And then there were unsurprisingly, a lot of AI announcements at Connect because they're kind of trying to turn that event from a pure Windows developer kind of event to more like, hey, we want you to be, developing existing kinds of Windows applications, but we also want you to add AI thing to everything. So another open source announcement they made was that they're open sourcing this thing called Onyx. And Onyx stands for, let's see, I can never remember this, Open Neural Network Exchange, which is a spec and a platform that Microsoft and Facebook announced together in 2017. If you remember when Microsoft announced Windows Machine Learning, Windows ML being part of Windows 10, if you look inside of what that is, what that stack is, the Onyx inference engine is right in the middle of it. And that's the piece that Microsoft is open sourcing. So they're saying, if you have a certain kind of machine learning model that you want to use, a certain kind of toolkit, whether it's PyTorch or TensorFlow, we're going to support that. And you can extend and customize and build with that using the open source version of Onyx. So I think that was a good one. Azure Machine Learning also went GA yesterday. So that to a lot of people is a big deal because Microsoft has this service in Azure that is meant to help you if you want to take advantage of machine learning and do it in a way that it's already prepackaged for you and you can just access it through Azure. You would use Azure Machine Learning Service. There was a lot of stuff though. I don't know if there was anything else that caught your eye, Paul.
That was the biggest stuff to me was that open sourcing in WPF and WinForms and then .NET Core.
Yep.
Well, .NET Core 3.0 preview 1 and then the .NET Core.
3 preview 1. Yep.
Preview, yeah, and then the preview of Visual Studio. Those are the big ones. They had a whole book of announcements. It was like 36 pages.
Stay tuned.
It's just a lot of stuff. But those are the big ones.
Yeah, I have news on the book coming up in the picks.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
No, it's okay.
All right, should we talk about Microsoft versus the FCC?
Yeah, just real quick. I find this to be kind of fascinating because I again, in my kind of Pollyanna way, I keep talking about things like, for example, 5G has been in the news a lot this week because Qualcomm is having their Snapdragon event out in Hawaii, and they're talking about, they talked about 5G yesterday, and 5G is going to change the world, except it's not going to change the world if you live like the Unabomber or in a rural part of the United States or whatever, because the coverage for that stuff out there is terrible. And this is something I hear from people routinely. I'll talk about the future and how awesome it's going to be, and 5G is so great because you can access your movie or your data more quickly from the cloud than you can from local storage. That's how crazy fast it is. And it's like, hold on a second, I live in rural Montana or something. Like, that doesn't happen here, And there's some debate about what the size of that audience is. So, for example, the FCC says that broadband internet is unavailable to roughly 25 million Americans, 19 million of whom live in rural communities. So there are I don't remember the exact number, 350, I think it was 362 million people in the United States, 25 million don't have access to broadband. Doesn't seem that bad, But Microsoft has some different data. So, for example, they cite a Pew Research study that claims that 35% of Americans don't have access to broadband internet, or more like 113 million people. So Microsoft decided to look at its own data to see what this looks like. And they have all kinds of online services, right, including Windows Update, but also things like Outlook.com and Office 365 and so forth. And they can tell how fast their internet connection is when they access the service. So what does it look like in the United States? Well, according to their data, about 163 million people in the United States, that's half the population, don't have access to broadband internet. And so what they're doing is petitioning the FCC to look at this data and to readjust their numbers, because this will adjust government spending and also industry spending on getting those people up to speed, because they're kind of like an unheard, minority. I mean, and this may explain in part why I get so many complaints when I write about this stuff, because I live on the East Coast and we have really good bandwidth here. But anyway, I just thought that was kind of interesting that they kind of came out with some actual numbers that's, I would say, is based on hard data rather than on just like a study or a survey.
So their Project Air band is, they say this is a problem they can solve. Well, but how are they going to solve it?
No, they can't solve it with this thing. So Microsoft is using white. Well, no, because they're only one company, right? So a couple of years ago, Microsoft said, we have this goal that by 2022, we're going to put 2 million people that are in rural areas on broadband internet. 2 million people is a drop in the bucket. Like, it's not insignificant, but compared to the 163 million people that aren't getting broadband, I mean, they're really not making much of a dent. So this week, they announced an update to that plan. They're actually going to now strive to get 3 million people, right? So again, 50% gain, but compared to 163 or whatever the number was, 162 million people, still a drop in the bucket. And so what they're saying is that this can only work if the government gets involved, if private industry gets involved. There's got to be an agreement that we're going to get over this hump. And so using white space is somewhat controversial because there are carriers and TV stations and so forth that think that this is going to result in disruption of signal and so forth and whatever. But Microsoft, again, they're trying to use data to push their point home, which is that when you look at adoption of communications technology, there's a really slow uptick when you have to put in physical infrastructure in the form of cables, right? So you think, again, not to use the cabin in the woods thing, Ted Kaczynski's out there in his little cabin, you get a string like a trunk out to the guy's house. It just doesn't make sense financially. It's the reason why huge telecommunications companies like Verizon and AT&T have walked away from plans that they had previously announced to bring the entire state of Vermont online or whatever it might be, because what they find is that those last mile problems are really expensive. But they're not expensive, or they're not as expensive when you go wireless. And so the uptick on wireless deployment of broadband is actually very fast. Like, it spikes really high. And so this is one of those ways that they can get wireless internet out to these rural areas, is using the white space frequencies. So that's what they're trying. But they can't do it themselves. They need a broader buy-in.
Right, but they said these devices were costing more than $800, but now they're
now they're like $100.
$300. Yeah, they say cost less than $300. So
yeah, it all comes. It happens quicker when it's wireless.
Yeah,
it's just not as expensive.
I think it's really important. I don't know if you know this, Paul, but more people than just the Unabomber live in rural areas. So.
I did that. That was a joke. I apologize to whoever I might have offended with that. Of course, I know that.
Emma's Pennsylvania.
You drive 5 minutes from my house and you're in the middle of a farm. I get it, but no, I'm joking. I feel very strongly about this issue, to be honest. Like, I feel that your access to high-speed internet is paramount, because it's almost like this is your ability to learn what's happening in the world. It's your ability to be able to make informed decisions as a voter, and it is arguably thus a constitutional right of yours. Like, I literally think it's that important. The problem is Microsoft can't solve this problem. Microsoft can come up with ideas, they can give data, they can provide solutions, but it has to be a combination of government and private industry as a whole. And Microsoft is not part of the communications industry. I mean, they have a stake in it, of course, because they deliver online services over this connection. But this is one thing that Microsoft's doing right now that I actually really appreciate. I think this is very, very necessary.
So what they're doing is more than just marketing, PR.
Well, I mean, their critics will tell you that is what they're doing, right? That, in other words, of course, Microsoft is doing this. They want to sell you Office 365. But like I just said, this goes well beyond that. And Microsoft is not a charitable, altruistic company. I get that. But this is an actual real need, and they're doing the right thing.
Absolutely. I mean, for education, it's like, it's like in the past, keeping people from learning how to read. I mean, this is...
Exactly. It's suppression of education, of voter suppression, of just, it really falls into a lot of the problems we have with our society today, for sure.
Mm-hmm. All right, are we ready for the tips and picks of the week?
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm going to tell you how to get one of those airband things in your house. No. So 3 years ago, I think back when I started Thurrott.com, I started to go back and I was revisiting some kind of classic topics from the past. And one of the things I wrote about was the ability to go online and get an ISO for your version of Windows, which could have been, Windows 7, 8.1, or Windows 10 was just coming out or going to come out. And the reason you wanted to be able to do that is because you buy this PC, it's full of crapware from your PC maker and extraneous utilities and all this other stuff. Maybe you've used it for a long period of time. You never created, or you've lost a recovery disk that you might or might not have gotten from the PC maker. And Microsoft offered a way for you to get that thing so you could go, clean up your PC, just start over from scratch. If you have Windows 10, you're all set. This system has always worked really well. There's a reset thing built into Windows, and Microsoft offers an ISO you can download very easily from the internet. That's always been the case. It's always been great. But as soon as I popularized this for Windows 7 and Windows 8.1, Microsoft took those ISOs offline. And so I started getting email from people. This is like early 2015. Like, you had this URL. It doesn't exist anymore. Do you know where I can get this stuff? And it disappeared for a while. So I don't know when it came back or how it came back or why it happened, but Rafael Rivera contacted me the other day and he said, hey, by the way, I don't know when this happened, but if you go to the Windows download site, you can actually download these ISOs again. And sure enough, if you go to the Windows, I think it's called the Microsoft Download Center or whatever it's called, /Windows, like download.microsoft.com/Windows, I think, you'll see links for Windows 10, Windows 7, and Windows 8.1. Now, there is a big caveat here, unfortunately. If you click on the Windows 10 link, you're all set. You're going to get an ISO. It doesn't matter who you are, you're fine. But if you go to Windows 8.1 or Windows 7, you're going to need a valid product key. So this is something you're going to want to do ahead of time, not when something goes wrong and your computer doesn't boot anymore, because you do need the product key before you can download this thing. So, as a matter of like disaster recovery, this is something I kind of preach on and off as time goes by. You need to make sure that you have a way to get Windows reinstalled in your computer. It's harder, unfortunately, if you have Windows 7 or Windows 8.1. If you have Windows 10, you're pretty much all set. This stuff is readily available, but I think it's cool that they finally brought it back in somewhat limited form, but for the older supported versions of Windows 2. So it is there.
Did you also want to criticize Boot Camp before?
Yeah, Boot Camp sucks. So I bought I first bought a Mac in 2001 when Mac OS 10 was coming out. I bought an iBook specifically to run OS 10. It came with OS, I don't know what it was, 8 something or 9 something, whatever it was. And you could dual boot with 10. 10 was not the default, but it was still improving a lot and blah, blah, whatever. So I've always had Macs. My latest Mac was a MacBook Air that I bought several years ago. As you know, Apple didn't update the Air for a long time. I looked at MacBook Pros, which are expensive. I looked at the little MacBook Air, MacBook, which seemed kind of underpowered. And then when Apple released the MacBook Air, the new version this past month or so, I bought one of those. And it's great. It's a great laptop. It's a great upgrade, whatever. But I had heard that Boot Camp had improved over the years. And I was really looking forward to experiencing that because Boot Camp is terrible. And Boot Camp is a way that it's an Apple utility built into Mac OS that lets you partition your hard drive, install Windows on one of those hard drives, and then dual boot between the two systems. And there's a myth out in the world, by the way, that the Mac is like the best way to run Windows. And I got to tell you, the Mac is maybe not the worst way to run Windows, but it is not a good way to run Windows. And I think it's very obvious it's done on purpose. The drivers that Apple supplies are not particularly efficient. They don't provide you with a lot of utility, so you can take advantage of unique keyboard features or trackpad features, whatever. Performance is terrible, which I verified using PC Mark 10 benchmarks. It's like half the speed of a Y series processor, HP or whatever. It's terrible. And I'm sorry to report that aside from supporting dark mode, this thing hasn't changed. It's exactly the same. It's never changed. It's exactly the same. Obviously, they must supply new drivers for the new hardware, but the experience, the way it works, the way it looks, hasn't changed at all. And so I'm going to test this again soon. But what I have found in the past was that if you need to run Windows or Windows applications on a Mac, which I think is less and less common these days, honestly, but if you do, you're probably better off with a virtualization solution. I use Parallels Desktop, but VMware Fusion, whatever. So I'll test that soon. But I was just really disappointed to discover that this thing hadn't really changed at all, because I like I said, I was under the impression that it had, but it hasn't. It's terrible.
Sad. We have app picks of the week. You have app picks of the week, enterprise picks of the week, code name picks of the week, beer picks of the week. But before we get to all that, I want to take a minute to thank WordPress. If you live in this world, you are going to be Googled. Someone's going to Google you and you want to, or Bing you. Someone's going to Bing you, let's say, since we're doing Windows Weekly. And you're going to want them to see what you want them to see. You don't want them to see whatever pictures someone else put on the internet of you. You want your place on the internet. You want that. That's where you want people to go to see what you're all about. I do that at WordPress. I have a WordPress account. It's meganmaroney.com. You can also get there at goatswearingclothes.com, just in case anyone is interested in goats wearing clothes. You're not going to see that. You're just going to see the stuff that I want you to see. Turn your vision into a reality. Launch your website. It is super easy. At WordPress.com, you can choose from hundreds of designs to match your vision and establish your brand no matter how much design experience you have. It's hassle-free. WordPress takes care of the hosting, the security, and the software updates. You can focus on your site. You don't have to worry about all that extra stuff, which is so nice. I don't know if you know this, but WordPress now powers 32% of the internet. That's a lot of people who are depending on WordPress for good reason, because they are dependable. You can upload images, video, audio, and so much more. You can import your content. You can export content. So say you've used some other site, you can export all that content into WordPress. It is so easy. You can embed YouTube videos. You can embed tweets. It's really easy to search to get help if you're confused. You don't have to waste. In the past, you'd just spend so much time coding your own website, writing all the HTML, and you would just then never really get very far. But with WordPress, it's very easy. It's your site. It's your home. It's your content. You can grow your audience. You can reach new customers. They have built-in SEO. So that's what I was talking about before. If someone searches for you, they're going to find this. They're not going to find all the other stuff. And it's going to be buried somewhere else. Social media features. They have marketing tools. You can have if you spend a lot of time on Twitter, if you spend a lot of time on Facebook or Instagram, all that content can easily be ported right into your site so that you're not having to just say, oh, I posted that on Instagram. I guess I'll also post it on my site. You don't have to do that. You can do it automatically. You can use the WordPress app. It works on any of your devices so that if you want to manage stuff, you can do it wherever you are on whatever device you're using. Launch your website with confidence, knowing you can get help from a 24/7 support team whenever you need it. WordPress plans start at just $4 a month. So $4 a month is not a lot for that security and the SEO. It's all included. Right now, get 15% off any new plan purchase. Go to wordpress.com/windows to create your website and get 15% off just for Windows Weekly listeners. WordPress.com/windows. Don't forget to add Windows, and then you get 15% off your new website, WordPress.com/windows. And we thank WordPress for their support of Windows Weekly. All right, the app pick of the week, Typora. Whose pick is this?
Yeah, I get a lot of. So I've mentioned in passing over time that I use Markdown for writing, and this confuses people because I'm a Windows user and I'm not on a Mac. And what is this thing, and why do I do this? And there's a long story behind it, but it basically has to do with the fact that the book publishing services I uses Markdown on the back end. Their word conversion software is terrible. And talking over this with Raphael probably 2 or 3 years ago now, 3 years ago maybe. He finally just said, look, could you just write Markdown? I mean, why don't you just write everything in Markdown? And so he found an editor that made sense for me at the time. It's not supported anymore or updated. And so whatever, here we are 3 years later. So I still use that unsupported Markdown editor, by the way. But I spend a lot of time, as I often do, researching other things. I found that there are many great Markdown editors on the Mac. We don't really have that many on the PC. But one great one is called Typora. It's Typora.io, I think, is the URL. It is free, at least today. It's in beta. It's available on the Mac. It's available on Linux, and it's available on Windows. It's kind of this trendy new millennial style editor. It's minimal looking. It works like a rich text editor. Control B, Control I will do formatting. Probably Shift Control K or Control K probably inserts URLs. I don't remember, but it does all that stuff, and I think it makes the needs of most people. It's funny, we had talked about Word earlier, but Microsoft Word is awesome, obviously, but it's also kind of big and heavy and does a lot of stuff, and it's complex, and I think it's more than most people need. And so this is kind of, if you want to look into something that creates plain text documents that will be readable everywhere forever, Typora or something else like that might be of interest. As an aside for you developer type folks, I was also talking to Raphael about his recent switch over to Visual Studio Code for writing. Visual Studio Code, of course, is a developer editor. And why on earth would you use this to write, like creative writing or, writing or whatever? It's a good question. But Visual Studio Code is extensible. And so there are add-ons that add things like spell checking and keyboard shortcuts that are familiar to word processing users and so forth. And so this is actually something I have looked at for the past couple of years, ever since Visual Studio Code became a thing. And I've found Visual Studio Code to be a little complex. I do have a developer background, but I've actually started using it. And so we'll see if I can make this switch. I have specific needs, I guess, when it comes to writing and to this type of thing. And it does support the dual pane view that I like, which is not something you would see in Typora. But I'm not recommending this for most people. It is something I do. I'm kind of weird at whatever, but just so you know, that is a possible capability. And what else? I had something else. Oh yeah, this is kind of cool and related to nothing, but Google announced this week that they've added a Vermeer gallery to their Google Arts and Culture app. Right now, this app is most famous because it has a selfie feature where you can take a picture of yourself and it shows you what work of art you look like. Right, that's the only reason anyone's ever downloaded this app. But good for Google trying to push arts and culture on people. The Vermeer thing is kind of interesting. This is a Dutch master from the 17th century. It's actually, I'm not really that into art, but he's one of my favorite painters. I like this kind of real life type stuff. But one of his paintings was stolen as part of that Isabella Gardner Stewart Gardner Museum heist in Boston, early 90s. His work, and he only has like 70 something paintings, are spread over, I think it's 17 different physical locations in the world. So there's no way you can go and see all of them in one place, except now you can in this app. And it's cool because it's like an AR thing. And so basically you point your camera at some flat surface and, like a floor, and it builds a little, AR gallery, and then you select the room you want to go into, and then you're in a gallery and you can look around and zoom in on the paintings. It tells you what they are. It tells you more about them. It's free. So, add a little art to your life. It's cool. It's on iOS and Android.
Love it.
Yeah.
I never downloaded that app. Wasn't there some sort of a controversy associated with they were like stealing all of our faces or something?
Yes, I'm sure.
Oh, man.
Well, yeah, it's Google, of course. But I mean, if you, what I found out is that I looked like it was like a painting of like an old bald guy. I don't know if it was someone like some Benjamin Franklin looking thing. I should do it again. I have no idea.
Yeah.
But it was, it looked nothing like me. I hope. I don't know. But yes.
Yeah, they're always stealing. They already have all our faces.
It's Google. You just have to assume
everything.
They do.
Enjoy the art, and they'll steal your soul. It's a good trade-off.
Yes, exactly. All right, the enterprise pick of the week, the book of news.
The book of news, right. So Microsoft started doing this thing with journalists before big events like Connect and Ignite, and they give us this thing called the book of news before the event. It has an explanation of all the announcements they're going to make, links to the websites that have more information. It's got everything in one place. It's got an index. It's awesome. And lately, they've been making these available to anybody, not just us, after the event happens. So if you want to see the 22 pages of the book of news from Connect this week, all the developer announcements, here's how you do it. Go into any browser, and type Book of News Connect, and you'll be sent to the Microsoft News site, and there it is. You can download it, look at it, use it to your heart's content.
Whoa.
They made it sound so special when they gave it to us early.
I know. No, it's for everyone, not just for us. Yeah. And it is pretty helpful to have everything in one place because there were probably at least 60 announcements at this event for developers. So if you're a developer and you care about anything in the Microsoft stack, you probably want to go get that book.
Do you guys usually go to this conference?
I used to go every time they had it in New York because it was here.
Yeah, and I was planning on going to this year because it's in New York and I love New York, and they moved it to Vegas. Probably because I moved closer to New York.
That's probably the reason.
And the code name pick of the week, which we've already
Code name pick is Chromium. And the reason I made it the pick this week is because the walking cat on Twitter reminded me that I had talked about Chromium being a potential Microsoft code name. So recently I wrote about how Microsoft's going to switch the type of code names they use for Windows. Instead of going 19H1 or Redstone 5, they're going to start using the same system that Azure uses, which makes sense since engineering is now in Azure. So they're going to use element code names. Right now, the current generation, so the thing Microsoft's building for 19H1 in Azure land is called Titanium. The thing that comes out around 1903, March next year, is going to be codename Vanadium, which is the next element in the periodic chart.
That's made up. Vanadium's not an element.
I mean, is it vanadium? One of these.
Vibranium?
I'm sure you're right. I'm just kidding.
No, vanadium is
it is. No, so then it should be
Unobtainium is the next
Yeah,
one.
unobtainium.
Right. It should be Chromium if they continued with the chart. But as you can imagine, given our first story today on Windows Weekly, that would create quite a bit of confusion if there was something called Windows Chromium. So instead, they made up a code name. They're using the made up code name Vibranium. They didn't make that up, but they're using that in place of Chromium. So I'm calling Chromium the code name that almost was, but luckily was not. For Microsoft.
We're all lucky.
We are. Can you imagine if they used Chromium and we started talking about Windows Chromium?
Well, I'm still stuck on the one core sounding like one care, which they got rid of anyway because that sounded kind of like a dirty word too.
That's funny. I never made that connection. I think I have completely blocked out one care.
I know, me too.
Like psychological reasons.
Yep.
Yes. So that was my year's writing for Microsoft security.
Oh, really? Wow.
OneCare. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because people would always
That was
complain.
Windows OneCare, right? Windows OneCare?
Yeah.
Windows Live OneCare when it first came out.
Yes, it was Live OneCare.
I felt very strongly back then that Microsoft charging people to fix a problem that it created in Windows was the most insane thing they have ever done.
Yeah.
You know?
Most
and they
people
eventually,
thought
of course,
that.
stopped charging. Yeah, crazy.
Yep. Now, Windows Defender still exists, right? Is that still a thing?
It does.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, but it's free and it's part of Windows.
Right.
Yeah, the technology has kind of continued on, but now it's what it should be. Something in Windows preventing the problem, not something fixing it after the fact by you spending money on it, which is just crazy.
Yeah.
Well, they would say they had to because, of the antitrust stuff.
Yeah.
Right. That was the excuse for everything.
Yes.
We want to do the right thing, but antitrust.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But antitrust.
Sorry.
I don't think that it was a huge revenue source for them, Live OneCare or Windows.
Probably not.
Beer pick of the week. My favorite part.
Beer pick of the week. Collective Arts Ransack the Universe is the beer pick of the week. We've been talking about constellations and all this. We might as well have a universe beer pick.
Is this
So
another
collective,
IPA?
but one you would like if you were drinking IPAs, actually. Hamilton, Ontario, Collective Arts Brewing is a really awesome brewery, and they're starting to distribute more in the U.S. They make IPAs, they make sours, they make dark beers, they make all kinds of things. But this one, Ransack the Universe, it is an IPA. It has a lot of hops in it, but it also has a ton of malt in it. So when you're drinking it, it's not bitter at all. It's like, oh, wait, this isn't the kind of IPA I think of when I think of an IPA. It's something non-bitter and balanced. I can't say that's Paul Thurrott in a nutshell because I would say he is unbalanced.
I'm slightly unbalanced and bitter. I think that's a fair, the IPA of tech bloggers.
Yes, that's you. That could be your new tagline, the un-IPA. But yeah,
I am in PA after all.
You are. So yeah, if you think you might like to try an IPA, but you're scared off by the bitterness and the overly hoppiness that is true of many of them, which I happen to love because I'm a bitter hoppy person. Instead, you should try this, Ransack the Universe.
Do you have a new? Do you have a new Hangout now that the Rattle and Hum?
Yes.
Oh, so sad to see your photo.
I know. So I've been experimenting with some places around here because we need to find some new Hangouts, and I've got a couple candidates.
Joe, how on earth are you going to find an Irish bar in New York City?
I know there aren't that many.
many.
It's tough. I've got to really seek them out. But yeah.
If you just eliminate all of the business names that start with O apostrophe or Mick.
I know. Well,
What's
right
left?
next to the old Rattle is Foley's, and everyone's like, "Oh, you should go to Foley's." I'm like, "Foley's is a terrible bar. I'm not going to Foley's."
Damn the convenience.
I know.
What are they
But
going to put there? Do you know what they're going to put in the Rattle and Hum?
So the reason Rattle and Hum East closed is because they doubled the rent. So I don't know what will go in there for double the rent.
It's going to be like a nail place, something like that. I'm going to get
they're going to make a lot of money.
Nails.
They're going to make a lot of money to pay that rent.
What do you have against sparkly nails, Paul?
Yeah.
What do you have against sparkly nails?
Wow. I'm apparently going after all kinds of groups of people today. So how long does it take you to get to Rattle West?
Well, it takes on foot about 20 to 25 minutes.
Yeah, that's too far.
Not that
Plus,
far.
it's not the same, right? It's kind of
not the same.
There's a hotel crowd in there. You don't get like the regulars, you know?
No. Although they're trying to get us regulars to go there, but there are other places in this neighborhood. I'm doing my research, Paul. It takes time.
You got to hurry up. I will have to come to New York eventually.
Don't worry. We'll have a place to go.
Okay.
Don't worry.
I can only climb your water tower so many times. I need a place I can sit down.
I do.
All right. Well, it's lovely spending time with you all and you all watching. This is Windows Weekly, recorded every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Pacific. Leo will be back next week. Mary Jo Foley at allaboutmicrosoft.com, at Mary Jo Foley on Twitter and Instagram, and Paul Thurrott at Thurrott.com. And you're just Thurrott on Twitter too, right? Thurrott.
Yep.
On
Twitter
Instagram too. And Instagram. I follow you both. And thanks so much to you for watching. You can watch live, or you can download it on any place you get podcasts, or watch on YouTube. You could even watch on your Apple TV if you're into that sort of thing.
How dare you?
Or you could watch on another TV that's not an Apple TV. I know. I guess I'd have to get one.
I'm actually
jab
not sure how else you would get it on another. Well, I guess through YouTube or something.
Yeah, or an Android TV. You can get it on an Android TV.
Yeah.
I have an Android TV.
You do?
I do. I hook my Apple TV up to my Android TV. So I do it.
Somebody has to have one.
Exactly. Yes. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next week on Windows Weekly.